So as you all know, what I've been doing for the last, well, you don't all know because some of you are new, but anyway, for the last 3 weeks I've been exploring this short book, which is a transcription of a talk that Bhante Sangharakshita gave many years ago, 1969, was it, Patrick? Yeah. And it's got seminar extracts of other things that Bhante is teaching. So one of the things that I'm trying to do is try to introduce you to Bhante Sangharakshita himself, the founder of the Triratna Buddhist order. And I'm trying to sort of talk more about the themes that he explores in this talk and in the seminars. So the themes I've been exploring are breaking through negative emotion, breaking through psychological conditioning, and today we're talking about breaking through time. So it's going to be a long night. What we're doing is just keep talking. That's weird. Breaking through time. Yeah. So we do have more copies of these now. So yeah, I'd really recommend that. I'm very pleased with them. They're very easy to carry around with you. You can just read Bhante's lecture and then see what he's like in seminar. In other words, most of his teaching was done in small groups of people, exploring a Buddhist text usually. I was never taught by him, but I knew him quite well. He died 7 years ago, something like that. Strangely, he's very alive in my mind, so sometimes when I talk about Bhante, I talk about him in the past tense. Sometimes I talk about him in the present tense, which is a bit confusing. But people are alive in your mind after they're dead. Anyway, so I'd really recommend having a look at that. So tonight I want to talk about breaking through time. So I'll say a little bit about that in the first half, then we'll have an obligatory tea break. And then I'll say a bit more, obviously. But what I want to do this week, if I can, is try and talk more about the goal of Buddhism, which is famously difficult to talk about. The last 2 sessions, and you can catch up on them, as I say, without making any off-colour jokes about it, you can catch up on the other sessions I've done on YouTube. They were more about the path, and especially the Buddhist path in this modern context, which certainly I've been thinking about a lot, because Jan Varcher and I are writing a book about Buddhism, and I'm particularly wanting to place Buddhism in a modern, even a postmodern context. So I've been talking a bit about some of those thoughts. But today I want to talk more about the goal of Buddhism, and see how that goes. And I've also created these little short films that go with these. So those of you who have signed up to the newsletter or whatever it is, you'll get another little film tomorrow, another angle on breaking through. I think it's called Breaking Through Narcissism. Yeah. Ooh. Very contemporary, very this moment. Anyway, so I wanted to start with an image from the Buddha's biography today, which is an image that keeps coming back to me, which is, this is before the Buddha gained enlightenment. Famously, he practiced asceticism, self-mortification. And traditionally, he's supposed to have gone further than anyone had ever gone. He practically starved himself to get death. He slept outside in the winter. He sat in the blazing hot sunshine. He did all those things that ascetics even now do. Yeah. And he decided, nearly on the point of death, that asceticism, at least extreme asceticism, didn't lead to enlightenment. So he had what, actually, if you translate it correctly, would end up being rice pudding. Somebody gave him some rice pudding. It never put like that in the sutras because it sounds so silly, but he did basically have some rice pudding. And then started to try and find a new way towards enlightenment. And then he had this vision, or rather sort of a visionary memory. He remembered himself as an 8-year-old boy sitting under a tree, what's called a rose apple tree, and watching his father plough. There's I could go down lots of avenues with all of this, but I'm trying to keep myself behaved. But anyway, watching his father plough, we've lost one already. That's what happens when the gags go down with the plough. It's getting boring. People think I'm on Netflix. Sorry, stop making jokes. Anyway, he has this visionary memory of himself as an 8-year-old sitting under a tree and watching his father plough. It's very striking, this memory, because it's simply a memory of watching his father plough. That's all it is. But he seemed to know that within that memory was a key to gaining an enlightenment, this quest that he'd been on since he was very young. And it's interesting because we know from Buddhist sutras that he'd already been taught by 2 meditation teachers before this event, and he'd experienced meditation experiences that are beyond exalted, remarkable, almost transcendent meditation experiences. For instance, he experienced the sphere of no thingness and the sphere of infinite space and so on, which sound extremely exalted. And yet this simple memory of being an 8-year-old boy watching his father plough seemed to contain something which, it's still, for me, I'm still trying to think about, but he seemed to contain something that he hadn't deeply enough realised, or something. And it seems to be to do with an experience of pleasure and well-being and absorption that wasn't willed. Yeah? So he didn't sit down, when he was an 8-year-old, he wasn't sitting down to meditate, he was just sitting down under a tree like anybody might. And in that experience became profoundly absorbed in a very natural way, which suggests perhaps that the meditation experiences he had before that were all very much based on a particular kind of forceful willfulness. Yeah, perhaps, I don't know. But it's very striking. But the main thing that strikes me about the story, which I'm still trying to, as I say, think about, is this one recounting of it. It says that even though the Buddha to be, little Siddhartha, little 8-year-old boy, sat there all day, the shadow of the tree never moved. He sat there and the shadow of the tree just stayed over him, which is a very beautiful image, isn't it? And as so often, beautiful images, they stay with you. I don't even know where that's from, but I remember it from many years ago. It stays with you as an extremely beautiful image of a little 8-year-old boy sitting at the base of a tree with a shadow that doesn't move. So that's something about, I think partly it's so beautiful because there's this mystical relationship between the boy and nature, which suggests, if you read images deeply, it suggests that there's some sort of breakdown between the usual boundaries of self and world. Usually we think of ourselves as a really existing self in a really existing world in which shadows move, etc., etc. The fact that the shadow didn't move is in a kind of ancient way of saying that division between really existing self and really existing world had at least softened, had somehow changed so that the shadow stayed above him, as if to protect the boy from the sunshine. Yeah. And that can sound fanciful, but any deeper experience, certainly that I've had, and probably that you've had, you start to feel, and it's almost symptomatic of deeper experiences, you start to feel that the natural world and you are in a new kind of relationship, particularly the natural world. I haven't experienced it so much in Westfield. Anyway, when I do, I will tell everybody about it. What I experienced in Westfield is all these little demons nibbling away at my psyche. I gave an alarm thing that says, you have 5 minutes to get out before my whole spirit has been completely nibbled away. Anyway, but this shadow not moving is some sort of image of this division between self and world, which we take to be ineluctably real, which Buddhism has never thought that, but we take to be ineluctably real, starts to soften so that the natural world seems to sort of cooperate with you. I remember this when I was on my 4-month ordination retreat many years ago. You start to have a almost kind of mystical relationship with the natural world. It seems to be in relationship with you, not in a sort of silly woo-woo way. Rocks don't talk and angels don't appear in trees and all that sort of thing. But there's something in all that the natural world seems to become aware of you. There's some sort of dialectic going on between you and the natural world, which is really what animism is, which we modern westernized people have completely lost touch with. But it's that sense of the natural world being alive and conscious in the same way that you are. That was always the view until pretty recently in history. Yeah. So that shadow not moving, do you see how it's a taste of some kind of new kind of consciousness in which self and world is overcome to a degree. Yeah. And then, of course, the second thing that it really shows is to do with time. Yeah. It's a metaphor about time, that time seems to stop. Yeah. So the boy watching his father plough, the metaphor of the shadow not moving is a very beautiful, poetic way of saying time seemed to stop. So that time seemed to come to a standstill. And that itself is very like the experience of being absorbed, especially very deeply absorbed. You already will have had experiences where when you get deeply absorbed in a way that's natural to you and feels unforced and feels spontaneous, which you can never quite do, can you? You can try and get absorbed in something, but sometimes suddenly you're really absorbed in something. And whether time seems to stop or not, but your experience of time can change, like very, very much. Yeah. Just the other day, I'm writing this book with Jan of Archer, and sometimes when I write, I get very absorbed. Sometimes I don't, but sometimes I do. And I looked at the time. It was time to go for lunch. I was meeting someone for lunch, and it really felt like it must be supper time. It felt like there'd been so much time. Your sense of time sort of stretches, as it were. And you've all had experiences where time seems to change. Certainly when you get very absorbed, time seems to evaporate. Yeah. Like if you have very deep meditation experiences, for instance, you can't tell how long they lasted. The ones I've had, it's like time doesn't sort of count anymore somehow. Yeah. And it's an incredible relief when that happens. In our contemporary life, we're so weirdly preoccupied with time. You know that famous sonnet by Shakespeare when he says, the hours, the minutes, and the seconds, or something like that, I think. Anyway, so it's the first time in literature the word seconds is used, because literally they'd only just been invented. He must have thought he was being very down with the kids, but he managed to put seconds in, because they'd just come in. You didn't have them before then. Now we have millions of seconds, don't we? We're kind of tied to the clock like never before, and yet all of us are feeling like we don't have any time. We've never been, probably as a culture, so aware of time and feeling so lacking in it. Yeah. Actually, weirdly, our attempts to optimize our life has created a life with no time in it, in the negative sense. So one of the teachings of that little tiny image is that if you want time to evaporate, you need to get healthily absorbed in something. Yeah? Whether it's writing or meditating or talking to a friend, the way to start to break out of time is to become absorbed. Recently I did a month-long solitary retreat in the Spanish mountains. And when you're there for a month on your own, you unpack your case and think, okay, what now? I think, nothing for a month. And you think, that's a bit, anyway, but what I kept doing is, when I thought, I'm here this Tuesday and the next Tuesday and the following Tuesday, when you get into that sort of thing, which is easy to do, all it means really is that you're not very absorbed, that you've got sort of leftover energy, so you start to think about time. And lots of us are doing that, aren't we? We often aren't really very absorbed at work, in communication, wherever we are. We're not really absorbed, so we're watching the clock. We've got sort of leftover energy. When you see children play, for instance, when they're very absorbed, they have no sense of time. Time is just a sort of weird abstraction. Do you remember when your mother used to call you in for supper? We used to have this huge garden and we'd just go off and play all day. And my mother would call me in for supper and just think, how boring. It's like, how did that happen? It's now evening, And we're losing that, aren't we, more and more? We're losing that possibility that time can completely open out. The place I most experience that is on retreat. Just that is a good enough reason to go on retreat, is to experience time disappearing like that. So I'll say a little bit about time, then I want us to do a little sort of talking about something. So in Bante's lecture, he talks about clock time, and I think he calls it organic time, does he, or natural time, something like that. In other words, there's a time that we put to the clock, and then there's the natural duration of things. I was thinking of an ancient Greek idea, which was that they had two conceptions of time. One was chronos, which from the word that we get the word chronological. So that would be something like our clock time, where everything happened in chronology. And the second kind of time was kairos, which means something more like mythic time. Time as it moves from crux to crux. Yeah? When you look back on your life, what you see is not chronological time, which is a kind of weird abstraction that we've all agreed on. What you notice when you think back in your life is much more like kairos, that deep in your life is a kind of mythic pattern that moves not from day to day, but from crux to crux. So that things that happened to you many, many, many years ago are part of your story in a way that most of it isn't. Do you see what I mean? I don't know whether you're catching my sense, but for instance, I remember when I was a choir boy, I used to sing in the choir twice every Sunday and get terribly bored, but I rather liked singing. And we sang this piece that had the words, "God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that he who so believe in him shall not die but shall have everlasting life." And it was from this piece called Stainer's Crucifixion. And I remember singing it, "God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." And I had this experience of, because I've never believed in God, but I had this experience of, I remember nearly crying. I was only about 10 singing it. But the idea that God so loved the world, in other words, that you were in a universe that was loved, and that so you loved the world so much, you'd give your only begotten Son, that who shall believe in him. I found it intensely moving. And it's a crux moment in my life. It seemed to say to me, there's something important about this. And it was not God or Jesus or the resurrection or the crucifixion, none of which I believe. And I think Nietzsche, as I've been going on about, I think Nietzsche was right. I don't think you can believe it anymore, even if you think you can. I don't think it's a bit like, for me, it's a bit like you, if you wanted you could say thee and thou, but it just looks a bit daft now. Yeah? It's actually a lovely way of speaking, but somehow you can't use those metaphors anymore. I think of God like that. But I experienced that crux moment was like a bit of a thin time where the words of the song and the beauty of the music and the beauty of the place, the church in my small town that I come from, and the sense of community between us all, even, however good or bad that was, seemed to sort of, like those spotlights that go over each other, seemed to create a sort of spot of meaning and a crux moment that seemed to say there's something really important in this. And it's almost as if your psyche kind of knows it. You don't need to, I didn't need to think, must remember this, keep this in mind. That the experience itself was a crux moment, yeah? Where I seemed to see something more than I usually saw. And then, of course, it closed, So the Greek idea of kairos is that your life is more like, in the depths of your life, is more like a series of crux moments. Some of them like that, some of them very, very painful. I had a very painful crux moment when I was living in Coventry in the Midlands. But moments that define and even change the rhythm of your life. And it's that kind of time that we're trying to inhabit more and more. Because our life is much more like the unfolding of a myth or a parable than it is like the unfolding of chronology. Chronology is kind of myth. Our lives, if we look at them deeply enough, are a parable that we're trying to live out. I mean, it's a bit like Charles Dickens said that his thing was to be the hero of your own life. It's a bit of the same idea, that your life is a story, and what needs to happen in that story for it to be the story of your life. You see what I mean? From very, very painful things, how can they become gifts? My own sense of pain, I was talking about psychological pain and trauma last week, my own sense of them is that they need to be turned into gifts. You can't heal them. I don't like this language of healing. I think it's too static and easily gets narcissistic. What you need to do is transform them into gifts. Yeah? So yes, so that's one way of thinking about time. We need to drop beneath chronology, which is so tedious and boring, and we need to find our way to kairos, this sense of our life moving from mythic crux to crux. Yeah. I want to say one more thing about it, then we'll get you to talk about it. Just still, in a way today I'm just playing with this idea of time. So one way of playing with that idea is to do with being absorbed. When you're absorbed, your sense of time changes. It even disappears. And one of the tragedies of our life is that we're bored because we're not absorbed. And because we're not absorbed, we get bored, and so on. Then the other idea is, you've got chronological time, then you've got kairos, this mythic time. But then all Buddhist practice and all religious practice across the world have always tried to imagine a new kind of place and a new kind of time. So if you come into this room, we've tried, this is actually where the original fire engines used to park, and the pole was in that corner. This was before my time. But you see, we tried to create a place that's not the usual place. It's not your workplace. It's not a domestic space. It's not the Tate. We're not trying to impress you with gorgeous things. It'd be nice if we could impress you a bit more, but never mind. It'd be nice if this was twice as big and more beautiful. But every religious space, from a cathedral to a ashram to a Buddhist centre to the church I grew up in, is an attempt to create a space that's beyond your conceptions of space. A new space. And you can tell that in a Buddhist context because you take off your shoes, and part of that metaphor is saying, I'm moving into a different kind of space. That's not a domestic space, not a work space, not a cinema, not an entertainment space, a new kind of space. Yeah. That's what we've tried to do here, which is what we've tried to do at Vajrasana. And all religious traditions do that. So you try to create a new conception of space itself, and I'll come back into this in the second half. But also you try and create a new conception of time, or you try to find a way of breaking out of time, and even creating this room. Do you see how even this room creates a bit of that? And if we all get absorbed, that sense of timelessness will increase, considerably. Even being in this room is trying to create a timeless space, a timeless new space. I'd like to see the centre even more like that. I'd like to see us much more like a temple. It's still a bit too secular for my liking, and I think we need to, have it still more grand. But it's a lot of money, if nothing else. Anyway, anyway. Don't worry, everyone's tightening up. Don't worry, it's not a fundraiser. So one of the ways in which traditions, and Buddhist tradition, let's say, particularly, tries to get out to time is by chanting mantra. So when you chant a mantra, and we'll chant one today, I don't know when, but we'll get it in somewhere. We'll chant a mantra. When you chant a mantra, the meaning of one of the meanings of mantra is to escape time. So what time, chronological time does, it seems to go in this terrible straight line from A to Z, from our birth to our death. And that's part of our westernized, nihilistic belief systems, which we take now to be facts, which are just unsecured beliefs. But that's what we do. We have this sort of linear idea of time carrying us to the catastrophe of our death. Nothing remotely like Buddhist idea of time. Yeah. But that is that's to see why that's why we're so obsessed with optimizing our life and performing ourselves, because we think we've only got time, and the literal time of chronology, not even the kairos time of deep time. Yeah, we think we've only got chronology, and we're going to be obliterated at the impact of our death, which is a stupid idea, a really stupid one, but which we all take to be true, you know, with that, because we haven't really thought about it properly. I mean, I'm sure you all have, and everybody on the YouTube has thought about it. Just a few people out there. Never crossed their mind. Anyway, so one of the things that mantra does is you just say the same. You know, usually in Buddhist mantras, you're saying the name of the Buddha or Bodhisattva. That basically you're repeating their name over and over again. But instead of time going from A to Z, time goes from A to A. So you say the mantra, and then you say it again, and then you say it again, and then you say... So in other words, you've still got a kind of thought, you've still got a kind of direction, but the direction goes back to itself in a sort of sacred loop, sacred spiral, outside of time. So saying this doesn't lead to saying that, like it does in ordinary speech. Saying this leads to saying that again, and again, and again, and again. So that's one of the ways in which mantra is trying to help you be in a spaceless space, a new kind of space, kind of transcendental space, figured by the Buddha, and that transcendental space is sort of timeless, and you chant. In tradition, you would chant for a long time. You just get into that mode of A leading to A, yeah, rather than A leading to B and C and D and so on. And then the last way that I've experienced this breaking out of time, and I'll say more about it in a second, because really breaking out of time is to do with breaking out of worldly consciousness, you could say. It's really to do with insight and enlightenment as much as anything else, more than anything else. But the other thing you experience on retreat is that on retreat you have the same program pretty much every day. Which is one of the reasons why when you get back from the retreat, it's very difficult to tell people what you did. People say, what did you do on retreat? You think, you know, we meditated, yeah. And then we had lunch, yeah. Then what did you do? We meditated again, okay. Then we had supper, okay. Then what did you do the next day? We meditated? You know, nothing sort of happens, you know. Someone says, is this it? You know. And yet, because nothing happens, what I experience at best, like last year, before last, was it? Anyway, sometime in the past, I led a 3-month retreat, and we were all in robes, and it's wonderful wearing robes because you don't change how you look, even, you know, which is part of religious tradition, so that you get away from all this thing about time and space and me and so on. But you just had the same day every day for 3 months, effectively, tiny bits of variation, but not very important ones. So that you feel like instead of one day leading to another, one day leads back to the day you've just had. Or one day leads to trying to do that day again. As if our lives are just one day. And that the main thing is to have that one day. And that is very metaphorically suggested, because our lives are like one day. You know, when you have children, I remember seeing, particularly when the first Alex, when she was growing up, you know, I'd see her go from a toddler to... She could walk, and when she used to scoot around on her knees, which she could do at great speed, so it took her longer to walk. So you see this arc of beginning, then it sort of flattens out, and then, you know, 2 years ago at this time my mother was dying, and you see that arc steepening down to its end, just like you see the day, you know. There's a kind of poetry that mirrors itself, a life, a day, so forth. That all you have in this life is one day, and the thing to do is to live that day, is to be aware on that day, is to be kind on that day, is to think on that day, is to, as Buddhism would say, go for refuge on that day. In other words, devote yourself to what's really, truly meaningful, rather than ridiculous things that we all get into and waste that day. You've only got one day. And on retreat, it's very strongly like that. Okay, you did that day, okay, let's try it again. Let's try it again, and let's try it again. Yeah? So let's just do the same thing again, and let's try it again. For me, that is the most meaningful thing you can do, is try and just live that one day. Yeah? And it's retreats that I've mostly experienced it. So that's a start to think about it. You've got this attempt in all religious forms to create a new kind of space that's sacred, where the normal rules of space don't apply. Where if you're in a cathedral, coloured light glows down upon you. I went to Barcelona. What's it called again? Yes, yeah, and I went many years ago, but they hadn't done many of the windows when I went originally. And you go in now on a bright day, and this incredible colour, and you see how that colour is an imaginal new kind of space that's beautiful, uplifted, neither to do with the dross of work nor the complacency of the domestic. Is an uplifting space. And in that uplifting space, you're trying to get outside of time. Now, both of those things are actually prefigurations of what, in a Buddhist sense, you're always trying to do, which is go beyond space and time. And I'll talk about that in the second half. For now, what I thought we'd do before we have tea, and we'll do a bit more meditation after tea. I talked for longer than I meant. I thought, let's go back together in little groups of 4. But perhaps I thought this might be a good moment. It kind of relates back to the first week. But talk about one of your crux moments. Like one of my crux moments, actually, was cycling here in 1985 on a Wednesday evening to learn mindfulness of breathing. My life completely changed on that when I arrived here in 1985. It's the absolute crux of my life, without doubt. That experience of singing when I was 9 or whatever was as another crux moment. So, and don't think about it too much, because that'll just get you into analysing. Just have a group of 4 of you, perhaps if you can, people you haven't yet met, and just go round your little group of 4. Be a bit aware of the time, because some people need more time, some people need to be squeezed a bit more. So time still exists on some level. So be a bit aware of the time. But we've got about 10 minutes just to go round your little group of 4. Yeah. So get yourself together just now. As I was saying, really every religious space is an attempt to communicate a new kind of sense of space, isn't it? Like if you go to Barcelona, if you go to the Blue Mosque in Turkey, if you come to the London Buddhist Centre, they're all actually trying to create a new kind of space that feels more beautiful, particularly more beautiful actually, more uplifting. Although it's interesting, I was looking around the shrine and thinking, yes, and one of the important things about this space is it's not a church. So the atmosphere is actually more relaxed than in a church. The fact that we're sitting on the floor changes the dynamic and so on. So there's that sense, though, in all religions, that there is another kind of space that you can experience. And like religious practice generally, you embody that in architecture. And because it's embodied in architecture, it can have a very strong effect on you. I've been to cathedrals that have a very strong effect on me just going into them. You can feel your body responds to the poetics of the space. Yeah? And then every religious form will have some sort of way of imagining moving outside of time. And I was saying in Buddhism, you think of mantra as an example of that. But, playing song is also an example of that, and so on. So there's always a kind of instinct. I'm actually making notes as I go on. But there is a kind of instinct, isn't there, in all religious forms, that there is a consciousness in which your normal associations of space are transcended and your normal associations of time are transcended. Yeah? So if you then put that next to, the great revolution in Western philosophy, particularly the philosophy of Kant and after him Schopenhauer, was the assertion that time and space are part of consciousness. They're not, I won't go through all the arguments because I can't remember them all, but the time and space are not how things really are. They're to do with our perceiving kind of mechanism. I mean, mechanism is an awful word because I don't like that metaphor, but it's because of our perceiving faculties we create, as it were, time and space. That's what Kant thought, and then Schopenhauer after him expanded on that. In fact, Schopenhauer called himself a Buddhist. He had a bust of Kant on his desk and an image of the Buddha on his desk. He read very bad translations of Buddhism that had come to Europe, and along with Hindu philosophy, and he was very struck that Buddhism and Hinduism had come to similar conclusions of his own. Yeah. So you see that instinct to transfigure space and to transfigure time. You can philosophize about it, but actually, experientially, you already have a sense that they're not quite right. Our conceptions of space and time are sort of problematic. And when you go into a church, when you go into any sacred space, if you're at all sensitive, you can kind of feel that directly. It's not a clever sort of philosophical idea. Yeah. So what that's pointing to is that we all have a kind of instinct for a space that's beyond the space that we experience and beyond the time that we experience. Yeah. And that's probably because space and time are functions of consciousness rather than really existing things out there. So Buddhism very much goes along with that. That insight that space and time are part of consciousness. It's very like Buddhist thought. Yeah, that Buddhism would say that space and time. Yeah, in fact, the sort of famous way of putting it is that mind precedes world. Yeah? That consciousness is primary, and mind precedes world. Yeah? And that world is a sort of almost like a condensation of consciousness. And this is very like, it's not exactly the same as, and you'd have to be a philosopher to know the difference, but it's very like transcendental idealism in the Western tradition. That consciousness is primary, not matter particularly. Yeah? I've been recently very, very struck by the work of Ian McGilchrist, who's a psychiatrist and philosopher, and he writes very much about this, as does people like Bernardo Kastrup. If you've listened to him, he's a modern transcendental idealist. But never mind, they're all rather groovy words. What Buddhism is saying is that there is an experience that you can have in which time and space change their nature in a way that we actually can't imagine. The Buddha clearly could navigate space. He didn't walk into trees, or when he was trying to eat, he didn't keep missing his mouth because he had no concept of space. Presumably, he could sort of get somewhere on time, but he didn't take time and space to be descriptions of reality. He took them as a way of being. That's all, in a certain sort of lightness. Yeah. So all of Buddhism, every moment of Buddhism, is a movement towards that kind of new consciousness, in that new consciousness, either space and time no longer obtain, or they're transfigured to such a degree that you can't really talk about them. And that's why we always have the figure of the Buddha at the center of a shrine room. The figure represents a new kind of consciousness that's beyond everyday consciousness, beyond egotistical consciousness, beyond your day-to-day mind, the kind of mind that got you here, that got you on the tube, whatever, that mind. Be completely beyond that mind, but really importantly, not separate from that mind. So normally when we talk about something being beyond our mind, we think of it as being separate, like God. Yeah. So in Buddhism it gets very subtle. It's saying it's not the same as you, but it's not separate to you either. And the whole of Buddhism is a path from everyday consciousness to transcendental consciousness. And that's what the Buddha figure represents. And one of the elements of that is a complete reconfiguration of time and space. I don't know what that means because I'm not a Buddha. This is where I need to be replaced for a Buddha to tell everybody that I've got that wrong and actually what it looks like. Interestingly, the Buddha himself was what's called metaphysically reticent. In other words, he was very reluctant to talk about the gold. He's very reluctant to talk about metaphysics generally. He was renowned in ancient India for being the teacher that didn't speculate. It's even got a epithet that means he who doesn't speculate. He thought that speculation, metaphysical, philosophical speculation, you're bound to get it wrong. So he taught primarily a practice which, through the intensity of your practice, reality would open out by itself without you having to think about it. Next year I'm actually having a year here of Philosophy East, where I'm going to interview a whole range of philosophers, starting with Rupert Sheldrake, the biologist, in January, and then moving to people like I'm having an evening with Emily Herring on Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, because I'm particularly interested in his ideas of time and so on. So we're going to have, and I've really got into philosophy, as you can tell. I'm not a philosopher by any degree. One of the weird things, after you've been reading it for a while, you start thinking, yeah, it's not enough. It's very groovy and you can get really into it. But Buddhism is like, yeah, that's all very interesting, but you need to actually change and experience these things. You can't leave them at the level of thought. It's a weird idea that you can, what's the point of thinking stuff? The whole point of a philosophy is to have a changed life, not to just have some clever things that you can say about space and time and Kant and so on. So the whole Buddhist project is to transform consciousness so that reality can shine through it. The Buddha wasn't particularly interested in talking metaphysically. He just sort of said, you're going to misunderstand that. Don't even think about that. Just watch your breath, and if you watch your breath for long enough, reality starts to open up to you, etc., etc. But we modern westernized people we're bombarded by all kinds of views. We've probably never been saturated so much by information. We're dazed by information, I think. We're in a constant state of dazzlement from sheer information. And more and more people that I meet and talk to, they've seen a bit of Advaita online, they've seen a bit of non-duality online, they've done some bits and bobs from all over the place. So we're having to actually talk to those views now in a way that I never did when I first came along. Bhante himself is very reticent about metaphysics. If you're not careful, it's very attractive to a certain kind of intellectual type who's usually rather emotionally blocked, even. Anyway, blocks will do, and socially isolated. And you see how that tendency has increased as we're all more and more living on through a screen. Our tendency to be intellectual, analytical, and to mistake intellectual, analytical understanding for experience has got more and more strong. Yeah. A friend of mine teaches people how to experience non-duality, which is weird. Because it's quite dualistic. If we're not careful, particularly in modern conditions, intellectual understanding replaces experience, especially if you can dazzle people with a bit of metaphysics. Yeah. I think that sophisticated metaphysics is becoming a surrogate for depth. I have friends who are very, very deep indeed, much deeper than me, but aren't particularly metaphysically sophisticated at all. One of my friends, he's a very, he comes from a very poor Irish background, but he has a very, very deep mind. But he's not an intellect by any means. And we mustn't mistake intellectual sophistication for experience and for a deeper truth. It's just a more sophisticated way of putting things. The Buddha would just say, all you need to know is all things are impermanent. And if you reflect on that deeply enough, the whole of your world will change, and space and time will seem to evaporate. If you reflect on it deeply enough. But I want to sort of talk us through one way of approaching this timeless time, this spaceless space, this new consciousness that Buddhism has taught for the last 2,500 years. And I touched on it last week, and I rather regretted it because it was all too brief. But I want to talk about the lakshanas again. So the Buddha is saying, okay, let's not think about stuff. You'll only get that wrong. You'll either get rather pleased with yourself or you'll feel stupid. Both things won't help. I just made you feel stupid because there was Marietta, because she's Greek, and then she was thinking, hang on, what's this word kairos? I've never heard. And it makes you think, oh my God, I've so lost my Greek. I've become too English. Kairos, never heard that word. And so stupid. Then she realised it was keros. And so that does sound more Greek, doesn't it? So excuse me for our Greek listeners who I've just undermined. It's keros. So when you go home, say we were talking about keros, not kairos. I think kairos actually used to be a gay club, but anyway, we won't go there. I think I did go there. Anyway, stop making jokes. Anyway, so keros. Yeah. Anyway, I'm distracting myself. So yes, the lakshanas, that's where we were. So the Buddha would say, okay, if you look at your relationship to reality, you feel that we all feel that things exist out there as an absolutely given fact, and that I exist in here as an absolutely given fact, and that when I die, I will be destroyed. Everything about me will be destroyed, but the world will carry on exactly the same. Yeah. And we think of those as being facts when they're actually beliefs. So what Buddhism would say is, okay, fine. So let's look at that a bit more. What Buddhism really is, it's not a philosophy, it's not a religion, it's not a way of life. It's actually a life's worth of looking at life in depth. Yeah? The whole project of Buddhism is to look deeply into your experience and to see whether it's what you think it is. Yeah? So the Buddha would say, well, firstly, look at your experience to see whether it's permanent or not. Yeah? Whether does anything last or not. So you think there's a really existing world and a really existing me. For it to be that, it needs to be lasting and perdure through time. So is that true? And he would say you need to look at life in that, through that, as it were, lens. Is that true? Do things last or not? Yeah? Does anything last? Yeah? And then he'd say, look at your life and see whether, look deeply into your experience and can you see if there's lasting satisfaction? Do you have a place where you feel just happy and fine and there's no discomfort, psychological, emotional, spiritual, there's no sense of lack? Yeah? Is there ever a time where you feel completely fine, yeah, in yourself, completely without any suffering? Yeah? Is that true or not? And again, the Buddha would mainly, I think, be asking you to look at your experience moment to moment, day by day. Yeah? And then finally he'd say, okay, so you believe you're a really existing self in this really existing world. Let's find that self. Let's see where it is. Yeah? If there is a really existing self, we should be able to get there. Let's find it. And so on. So those are called the three lakshanas, which means the three marks of conditioned existence. Now they're, as I touched on last week, they're not descriptions of reality. They're descriptions of where, how would you put it? They're sort of like the bum notes in our experience. If they're the kind of weak spots in our experience of reality. They aren't reality. They're the weak spots in our experience of reality. They're where we can actually make progress. They're where we can start to see through our experience and see that what we believe to be true cannot be true. Yeah? So you've got two primary ways of reflecting on the Lakshanas. One is, as it were, telescopically. Yeah? So you look at your life, especially through the lens of impermanence, as being incredibly brief. Yeah? In the Sutra of 42 sections, which was the first sutra to be translated into Chinese, or at least reputed to be the first sutra translated into Chinese, there's this lovely sort of dialogue where the Buddha is teaching these monks, and the Buddha says, okay, how long do you think life lasts? And someone says, it's like a day, isn't it? And the Buddha is silent, and then someone says, it's more like the length of time of a meal. And the Buddha is still silent. And someone says, it's more like a single breath. And the Buddha says, yes, that's what it's like. Yeah. So one thing we could all take up is just remembering that. Another sutra the Buddhist talks about life being like a dewdrop on a blade of grass. And it's a very beautiful metaphor, because the metaphor is beautiful, but it doesn't last. Yeah? But it's beautiful. So if we could really take up that reflection, and remember, Buddhism is not particularly wanting you to think about it lots, it's just trying to get you to see your life in that context. You know, that work meeting you're going to, that difficult communication you have, whatever it is, that life is like a dewdrop on the blade of grass, or like a single breath. Yeah? If we really understood that, not at the level of intellect, which we're so much mistaking for experience, but at the level of being, the first thing that would happen is you'd stop arguing. Yeah? The first thing that would happen is you'd stop polarizing, because it's really silly. It's just a complete waste of time. You just wouldn't want to. You wouldn't do that. You'd stop all of that silliness. You'd probably stop scrolling through Instagram as well. You'd stop arguing. You'd basically, and we all get moments of it where you suddenly think it is that quick. It often doesn't start until you're about 25, although I had it when I was much younger than that. But where you really think, actually, this is going very, very fast. Yeah. And Buddhism says, yes, and that's true. So you need to go into that more and more. That's not so that you end up with a kind of stoicism. Yes, things are going to end. Because remember, this isn't a description of reality. It's a method to break through into a new kind of reality. Yeah? So anyway, the first way of reflecting on it is telescopically, broadly in that sense. So what you can do in the meditation tomorrow morning, you can just sit there at the start of the meditation, just remember that your life is like a dewdrop on a blade of grass, or like a single breath. So do you see, as you went more and more deeply into that reflection, your experience, whatever it was, pleasant or unpleasant, neutral, awful, wonderful, would feel infinitely prescient? That isn't even a word. It would feel infinitely precious, wouldn't it? Because you'd be aware of how brief your life is, but you're not dead now. My own teacher, Sangharakshita, someone said to him, what happens when you die? And he said, the usual Buddhist answer to this is, you'll soon find out. And that is the great sort of practice to take up. You'll soon find out. Yeah. So in that context, it's going to happen very, very soon. And of course, it's the one thing you absolutely don't want to happen, and it's the one thing you have no idea when it will happen. Again, when people used to say to Bhante, oh, Bhante, what will you do when you die? He'd say, well, that assumes I die first. Very famously. Anyway, that's the telescopic way. But you see how it's not just an idea, because you're not careful, it becomes a platitude, just a truism. You're actually trying to see your life more and more in that context. Therefore, your direct experience would seem infinitely precious, because it's about to go, and you'd stop doing all that silly stuff that you do. I say you do, that I do, that we all do. You just think, instinctively and we completely naturally would just drop all that. You wouldn't even have to try if that reflection went deep enough. Yeah? If it was a lived experience that you got to, not just an idea that you can talk about. The second way of approaching the Lakshanas, all three of them, but you see that way particularly focuses on, it highlights the Lakshana of impermanence, the telescopic. The microscopic tends to, which is the next way of practicing it, it tends to highlight no self. Yeah? So in the microscopic way of looking, you sit down to meditate, or you're walking along the road, and you just try to go through the Lakshanas again. Is anything in my experience permanent? Yeah? Is anything in my experience ultimately satisfying? And where is the self in my experience? Yeah? So you try and take that up in this microscopic way, in a moment-to-moment way. Yeah? So for instance, in meditation, very classically, you take up the reflection, it's not me, it's not mine, it's not myself. So you experience the body, you think of you experience your legs, and you think, are they me? Are they mine? Do they belong to me? Our bodies are like something we've borrowed from the universe, which we're going to have to give back. All the elements of the body we're going to have to give back. We live as if they are mine. Our bodies don't belong to us, and nothing belongs to us really. So in this way of practicing, you microscopically, as it were, in meditation, see whether the Lakshanas are true. You don't tell yourself they're true. You just say, is there a self here? So, is there permanence, is there ultimate satisfaction, and is there a self? Yeah? And if you go into those reflections deeply, you find that there isn't. But you're not trying to jump that stage. You are trying to look deeply into experience. You're not trying to get anywhere else. You see that abstractions easily sort of lift us somewhere else, like, oh yes, things are impermanent. But you're trying to deeply engage with your lived moment-to-moment experience and see if your beliefs about it are true. You think you exist. Okay. Is it true? Is it there? Can you find a self? Can you find anything that perdures through time and so on? So those are two basic ways of working with it. And when the reflections go very deep, they open you up to a new way of being. They start to open you up to a kind of consciousness of a Buddha. They open you up to a wholly new understanding of space and time, for instance, because space and time are parts of consciousness. But you see, it's not by getting away from your experience, it's about investigating your experience with particular rigour and depth, yeah? And trying to see, is what I believe to be true. As you go into those reflections more, that you could call that a kind of spiritual death. You die to yourself, you die to your belief in a really existing self in a really existing world, and a new kind of consciousness is reborn. So Bhante Sangharakshita talks about spiritual death and spiritual rebirth. Yeah? That is the goal of the Buddhist life, is spiritual death on one hand, where you see that this self that I'm so preoccupied with protecting and embellishing and getting loved from other people and so on, that's a construction. Yeah? It doesn't exist in the way I think it exists. Yeah? So you die to your conception of self, and you're reborn to a new consciousness, which you can't very easily talk about, but which is beyond space and time, beyond the physical senses, and beyond the rational mind. It's easy to say what it's not. So it's not in space and time, it's not in the physical senses, and it's not in the rational mind. Yeah? It's beyond those things. Now, beyond is a metaphor here. It's not literally beyond them. You haven't suddenly sort of popped out of space and time and popped out of your body and popped out of etc., your physical senses and the rational mind. When we say beyond, it's metaphorically beyond. It's a way of saying it, you just can't talk about it. You know what I mean? But you get into that, whatever it is, through your direct experience. Yeah? by investigating your direct experience very, very deeply indeed. And a new consciousness arises, which is spontaneous, unwilled, completely fulfilling, endlessly opening up. You never get to the end of it, and so on. When you even touch the hem of that, it feels like the source of all meaning and value. You feel yourself to be who you really meant to be. I think I said that right at the beginning, that deep, or did I say it someone else? I can't remember. Deep experiences, it's not like you end up with this sort of universal abstract experience. What you experience is that this is who I'd always meant to be. This is much more like me, weirdly. Even though you're experiencing a consciousness that goes beyond you, it feels much more like you, and much more what you'd always meant to be, and that your day-to-day consciousness was a kind of mistake, that really you'd meant to do that. That was who you were, and you just kind of got distracted from that and became this, me sort of thing. So, two more things to say about that. So, spiritual death and spiritual rebirth is the goal of the Dharma life, beyond, as I say, time and space, beyond the physical senses and the rational mind. So no way of talking can get you there. No philosophy. Buddhism doesn't have any final metaphysics. It's not just trying to endlessly try to get the metaphysics right. It's basically trying to say, you need to change your life, which is why you might think about this sort of stuff. Not just to think about it, that's useless, So do you see how you can't practice spiritual death and spiritual rebirth without training? So you need three basic things. You need what Buddhism calls right view, you need faith, and you need metta. Yeah, so I want to finish with these things, and then we'll finish by doing a mantra. So to usefully, you see how, because you could reflect on the lakshanas and end up in a completely different place. You could end up with a kind of stoicism, couldn't you? Where you possibly grudgingly admit that nothing's permanent, like everybody knows that, basically. At least on one level, we sort of know that. I mean, we don't know it at all, but we, if I said, does anyone think anything is permanent, probably no one would say yes. You know it at a cognitive level, but not deeper. So, I got lost. I got distracted. What was I thinking? Right view. So, if you're not careful, you could just think, okay, so that's true, and yes, all things are dukkha, suffering. That suffering is inherent in life, and you could think, there's no real selfhood. You could even do that through a sort of postmodernist lens. You could get to all those places through a kind of postmodernist, deconstructive kind of lens. And you'd end up with a kind of stoic nihilism, wouldn't you? That, I'm going to die one day, I don't know when. Consciousness, I think I exist, but I just kind of don't exist. You'd end up with a stoic nihilism, which is nothing remotely like Buddhism's teaching. So you need to take up that practice properly and valuably, you need right view. Now, right view, one of the aspects of right view is realizing that nihilistic vision is a wrong view, that's not it. I can't teach right view now because it's too deep, but it's mostly a kind of instinct for truth. This book I'm writing with Yanavacha, it's going to be quite a long book and quite involved, but basically what strikes me about writing it is that he and I are trying to teach right view. And right view isn't a theory, it's not a kind of concept, it's a sense of the world that is right, if you see what I mean. You usually experience getting closer to it on retreat. It's more like an atmosphere than it's nothing remotely like an ideology, for instance. It's a sense of, it's allied to your aesthetic sense, where if someone's very kind or very honest, it has an aesthetic, you feel it to be beautiful. And you don't do that because you think about it, you have a kind of aesthetic, moral sense, all of us do. So if you see someone that's acting very kindly or is being genuinely honest, You feel extremely attracted to it. It's a kind of moral come aesthetic sense. Right view is a sort of deepening of that sense. You have to train in it. And one of the reasons we have study groups here at the London Buddhist Centre and why Buddhism puts such value on study and puts such value on me sitting at the front here trying to tell you things is because you're trying to learn how to train in right view. Yeah? So that you don't end up in just this nihilistic impasse, which so much of us are already doing without taking up the lakshanas. Then you need faith. The Buddhist word for faith is shraddha, which means literally placing the heart upon. And faith really is the emotional equivalent of right view. You have a sense that there is more to life than meets the eye, basically. And that sense that there's more to life than meets the eye becomes a fully lived experience. One of the things I would most like to teach you, if I could, would be faith. What we most need in the westernized world is faith. Not in the traditional religious sense of blind faith. There's no room for that in Buddhism, because Buddhism, remember, is about exploring in great depth your actual direct experience. It's not about some kind of dogma or doctrine or ideology being placed on top of that. But faith is an innate sense of inherent meaning in life, which we modern secular consumering materialists have kind of disavowed largely. Much to our, I said the other day, didn't I? We killed God in 1853 and it's not been a great success. It hasn't come out well. We've lost our sense of something beyond us that we can serve, that our life could make sense within a larger framework. Yeah? We've largely lost to that. And that is faith, shraddha. Yeah? And do you see, if you take up the lakshanas faith, you end up again in this sort of stoic nihilism, which has got some value but not very much. And then thirdly, you need metta. So metta is the Pali word for loving kindness. Because the great danger with any approach that's analytical like this is that it's one-sidedly heady, especially in a world, as I say, where abstract analysis is taking the place of experience. So you need also to train. You need to train in right view, you need to train in faith, and you need to train in metta. You need to train in not just metta, but kalyana mitrata, which is usually translated as friendship, but that's a rather pale translation of it. You need to be emotionally outward going, emotionally loving, warm-hearted, outward going, courageous, quick to make friends with people. Without that, your psyche will be literally too narrow to usefully reflect on the lakshanas, and you'll do it in a one-sided way, in a heady, intellectual way, and that will be distorting of you and the experience. Yeah? You need to do it from a heartfelt way. That's a heartfelt way that's underpinned by right view and animated by faith. Yeah? You can see why Buddhism puts so much emphasis on friendship, because it's remembering that self, our usual operational self, is mostly external thing. We're obsessed now in postmodernity with self as being something internal. And that's making us, as I say in tomorrow's video, being more and more narcissistic. Actually, self is largely to do with my relationship with you. Self appears in your relationship with others. It's something that happens between people. Yeah? So to be able to valuably reflect, you need to have very strong friendships. You need to care for other people. It can't just be this sort of intellectual word game. Yeah? So you can see that to experience this transcendental wisdom that through the lakshanas, you need this sort of threefold basis of right view, faith, and metta. So that's what Buddhism is. You first of all train in those three things. You try to train in right view, faith and metta, and you do that through meditation practices, through friendship, through going on retreat, through keep coming here and making friends with each other, learning more, becoming more emotionally healthy, less divided, less neurotic, less conflictual, less quick to take offence, etc., etc. All those ordinary human things that you can't bypass. On the basis of that, you might then think, actually, this is important enough to me to commit myself. So in this tradition, you take up spiritual death practices, particularly at the point of ordination. Because ordination is the place where you said that I've trained enough in faith, right view, and metta, thank you. I've got enough of a basis of that so I can usefully reflect on the lakshanas. And that's at the point of ordination in this system. It's in different points in different systems and in different Buddhist traditions. But that's basically what... And then if you do then reflect on the lakshanas from that threefold basis, you will find that life opens up to you. Remember, life will open up to you at any moment without trying anything. It's not that you're trying to learn that life can open up to you. It's already probably done it at times in ways that you would never have known and nobody could have ever taught you. You know, that singing God So Loved the World when I was 9 was a sort of opening of faith, except for I knew it wasn't in God. But it was a sort of sense of there's some truth in God so loved the world he gave his only begotten Son. It wasn't a literal truth, but there was some truth in it. I think that the way that Christianity then tries to manifest that truth is mostly unhelpful, at least after a certain point. But it doesn't mean to say it's not onto something. Yeah? So you need to train in right view, faith and metta. Then if you want to, some people will then think, actually I want to commit myself to this new way of approaching my experience in depth. Out of that comes this new experience of, well, this new kind of consciousness, yeah? Which is more than you, beyond you, but not separate from you, and which it's impossible to talk about because it's beyond words. Yeah? It's beyond language, it's beyond the physical senses. So what I thought we'd do to finish, rather than finish with more talking, I thought we'd finish by chanting a mantra and see if we can get into mantra. So you don't have to join in, but I don't see any reason why not. It's not going to sort of weirdly change your molecular structure or anything. And if you want to, those of you who want to, you could come and, during the mantra, if you want to, you can come and light a candle and place it on the glass in front of the shrine, or you can light some incense and place it in the incense holder. And when we do that, chanting a mantra, you just come up whenever you want, and don't worry, just you can scrum around it, and it's fine. What you're just trying to do is opening yourself to a new kind of consciousness. You're trying to say, when you make any kind of offering or any kind of mantra, I do not know about myself, I do not know about the world. So I'm just going to open to anything just now. Yeah? So that's what we're going to do. And we'll finish. And then what I suggest is at the end of that, put your cushions and mats away in silence, and then let's not talk until we're out into the cloakroom. So we get a bit of a sense of breaking through time. Yeah. So when you're ready, closing your eyes.